Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Warner, Congressman Davis, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here, and I thank you for the opportunity to speak. I don't usually begin my remarks with a story, but today I was going to tell you about a Nobel laureate professor and his chauffeur. And when I heard Tom Davis tell that story, I thought my second option was to talk about Shake a Booty. That one has been taken away from me. So let me tell you one that was told to me by a very wealthy Texas entrepreneur who subsequently ran for president after he told me this story. Ross Perot, at the time, was president of EDS, Electronic Data Systems, and we had been working on him to come to Fairfax County with a number of positions that, as I recall, was somewhere between 12 and 15,000 people who would be employed by EDS and its suppliers and others by the time this was completed. He was telling me on the plane, and this may have been autobiographical, I'm not sure, but he was telling me the story about a very wealthy Texan who had just completed the largest house in Texas with the largest swimming pool in Texas. And to celebrate this occasion, he invited all of his customers, his suppliers, his executives to celebrate, and he brought them out of the house onto the patio surrounding the pool that was filled with alligators. And when the cocktail time ended, before they went into the house for dinner, this wealthy Texan said, "Ladies and gentlemen, all my life I have admired courage. It has inspired me to achieve great things in the business sector. All of my American heroes have been people of courage. And I am willing to say to you, before we go to dinner, if there's anyone here courageous enough to jump into that pool filled with alligators and swim to the other side, I will give them anything they want, my house, my land, my money." And everyone laughed at the idea, seeing the alligator swimming through the pool. And as they turned to walk into the house for dinner, ignoring his challenge, they heard a splash. They turned around and they saw this young guy swimming frantically just ahead of the alligators as he went through the pool. He made it to the other side, got out breathing heavily. The wealthy Texan rancher walked up to him and said, "Young man, that is the most courageous act I have ever witnessed. Tell me what you want. You can have my house, my land, my money. What is it you want?" And the young guy says, "I just want to know one thing. Who the hell pushed me into that pool?" Perhaps that question has occurred to you. And I think Mark Warner gets the credit for pushing us into this pool. But when asked to hold forth on large topics, I often like to fall back on history. But with Ed Ayers sitting right here, it could be a little embarrassing if I fail to get it right. Dr. Ayers knows his stuff. Indeed, this celebrated historian may be one of the few people in the Commonwealth who actually knows about the Fat Nancy Trestle disaster up near Orange, Virginia. It occurred just off Route 20, the road that runs out towards Montpelier, James Madison's home in central Virginia. On a July morning in 1888, a passenger train crossed this trestle. It was about 40 feet high in the air, and it collapsed. As I recall, Dr. Ayers used this tragic event in one of his books in order to make a larger point about the reckless pace of railroad construction in the South during the postbellum era. You know you are not a real Virginian if you do not appreciate the joys and the ironies of historical trivia. And this particular trivia, which was not trivial at the time, gets better. No less a figure than General James Longstreet was on board, returning home from the 25th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. He survived, of course, but others did not, including the man charged with fixing the trestle and replacing it with a culvert. The poor man just happened to be on board. I think that is what you call an irony, and history is full of them. And if you're wondering about Fat Nancy, the part of the story, I believe that referred to the woman who lived near the trestle and liked to watch the trains go by. You see, history can be fun, full of lessons, and as I say, rich with ironies. I want to salute Dr. Ayers for keeping this story alive in his book, The Promise of the New South, even complete with a picture of the trestle. I'm sure it's very important to him that we not forget, and you can probably find his book in the bookstore here at the University of Richmond. Speaking of not forgetting, I was thinking the other day that it has been more than a quarter century since the General Assembly held a special legislative session at my request to pass new revenue measures in order to finance a growing Virginia's growing transportation needs. At the time, I regarded that not as an end, but a beginning. Surely, I reasoned, others would follow along and build upon our efforts. Surely, I thought, our lawmakers, of whatever persuasion, would understand that if the Commonwealth increases its population by a couple of million, there's a good chance that all these arriving folks will bring their cars with them. Surely, I expected our lawmakers would appreciate the relationship between the efficient movement of people and goods as essential to a growing economy, especially when we operate one of the most important port facilities in the world within a day's drive of most of the nation's population, next door to the nation's capital, and within a day's drive of 60% of the nation's population. But it did not happen that way. The loudest voices on the subject of economic vitality turned out to be the ones least interested in investing in it. Sort of ironic, you might say. I will say that Senator Warner, then Governor Warner, made at least two valiant efforts and only got frustration as his reward. I admired his attempts to advance the ball. As a matter of fact, I admire his efforts in Washington to advance any ball. This is a very fine and committed U.S. Senator we have, and I hardly mind saying so publicly. Besides, he offered me a free lunch today. Truth is, from a review of today's agenda, you appear ready to exchange some serious thoughts during this gathering. So I would not mind getting a few things off my chest. I do not do that publicly very often, but the organizers of this event were a little vague on their expectations, and I saw my opportunity. After all, the title of my remarks, Leadership Through Change, could cover just about anything. The point is, I think I can say pretty much what I want today, and the older I get, the more I feel like doing just that. So let me see if I can summon up some truth. Understand, I'm not here to beat the drum on any given cause, outside my own general interest in seeing our country and Commonwealth prosper. But I'm not kidding about the perspective part. It does change as you get older. There was a time, not really so long ago, that I was sure we could change things here in Virginia once and for all. Such are the hopes of the young. I still think that the challenges we addressed truly steered Virginia in a forward direction. But then you realize the limits of change, that it can be like a rubber band. You pull and pull in one direction, think you've made progress, and then zip, it snaps back close to where it was before. Don't look now, but the state's transportation system, at least when it comes to construction, is pretty much kaput. It is very frustrating. However, I take solace in the knowledge that political frustration in America has a pretty good pedigree. The founding leaders of our country, Madison, Jefferson, Adams, and the rest, experienced it too and said so. Read what they had to say towards the end of their lives, and doubt leaps off the page. They got the revolution done and secured passage of the Constitution, and they knew that these were monuments in civilization's path forward. They also knew that they would get credit for putting in motion the greatest experiment in self-government the world has ever seen. Still, towards the end of their lives, they wondered whether America would hold together. Would it endure? Would it last? Would it break into pieces? And of course, they were right to worry, because it very nearly did. We now commemorate the 150th anniversary of our national near undoing, the Civil War. But it was a close-run thing from the beginning. The creation of the United States affronted history. A working democracy had never been achieved before on this scale, much less with such diverse component parts. Understand, at the time of the American Revolution, Virginia's ties, culturally and economically, were far stronger with London than Boston. The back and forth exchange did not run up the Atlantic, but across the Atlantic. Virginia had been British for more than 150 years. Then, at a critical juncture, Richard Henry Lee returned to Philadelphia with a document the other colonial delegates so desperately needed from Virginia, a resolution for independence. It helped to bind the tie. The colonists came together, not perfectly, but sufficiently. We declared our independence. Then we struggled through a war with the British for nearly 6 years. And all the while, George Washington fretted and worried. If you haven't read Washington's dispatches, not all of them, just some of them, you've really missed something. In January 1776, he was in Cambridge, trying hard to get an army together. Washington issued a general order and urged his men to understand that for the sake of the well-being, health, and appearance, all soldiers must take pride in their person. He wrote that, quote, "While we have men, therefore, who in every respect are superior to mercenary troops that are fighting for 2 pence or 3 pence a day, why can we not in appearance also be superior to them when we fight for life, liberty, property, and our country?" End of quote. In other words, Washington says high ideals are all well and fine, but you have to look good too. Now I ask you, if that is not the mark of a true Virginian, what is? I mean, just look at Mark Warner. Look at John Warner, for that matter. Anyway, the founders got through the revolution, made it to Yorktown, and soon thereafter sat down to write the Articles of Confederation, which for a lot of reasons did not work. For instance, during the time that the Articles of Confederation were in existence, if you moved goods from New Jersey to Connecticut, you would find New York in the middle, collecting a tax. The Articles of Confederation did not produce a nation. So back to the drawing board, and flash forward, we find another Virginian, Edmund Pendleton, standing on the floor of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia on May 29, 1787, with the Virginia Plan in hand. Resolved, it says, that the Articles of Confederation ought to be so corrected and enlarged as to accomplish the objects proposed by their institution, namely common defense, security of liberty, and general welfare. As of that moment, ladies and gentlemen, we were on our way. The Constitution that emerged, the compromise document that forms the legal basis of our republic to this day, marks our genesis as a political nation, day one. But there were 1,000 good reasons why it might not have happened at all. From the Declaration of Independence to the Revolution, to the Articles, to the Constitution, our founders were constantly betting against the House being history. The other day, in fact, there was a very good column in the Newport News Daily Press newspaper on this very topic. It was written by my good friend Colin Campbell, the president of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. He notes in his op-ed that at the conclusion of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, on September 17, 1787, Benjamin Franklin got up to his feet and expressed some worry. "I confess," Franklin says, "that I do not entirely approve of the Constitution at present. But, sir, I am not sure I shall never approve it. For having lived so long, by better information or fuller consideration, to change opinions, even on important subjects, which I once found right, but found to be otherwise." You see, Franklin, too, had gained some perspective. He knew it was not going to be easy, and he expressed his concern that delegates to the convention would divide publicly once away from Philadelphia. "On the whole, sir," says Franklin, "I cannot help expressing a wish that every member of the convention who may still have objections to it would, with me on this occasion, doubt a little of his own infallibility." In my judgment, this was a great leadership moment and a powerful lesson in democracy. Franklin, as Campbell points out, effectively promoted a way of thinking about the business of democracy, of being an American citizen. He urged his colleagues to support what constituted a compromise, the new U.S. Constitution, and accept that no one ever has all the right answers. What a concept! An American political leader stepping up and conceding that he does not have all the answers. What Franklin understood is that in a democracy made up of strongly held but vastly differing opinions, a readiness to acknowledge imperfections may be the only way to ensure the republic's survival. Now, why do I recount all this to you, aspiring leaders of our Commonwealth? For two reasons. One, because in some ways, not much has changed since then. And two, it was not all that long ago. Let me take the second point first. Against the reach of American history, America remains a fledgling enterprise. Here again, as you move along through life, you get a different perspective. If I just take the people of whom I have direct memory, which would mean back to my great-grandmother, we have lives that cover 142 years. That represents more than a third of our nation's collective history. We are not an ancient people. And if you doubt that, take a ride down Route 5 outside Richmond and knock on the door at Sherwood Forest. Inside, you will find, assuming he does not shoot you, the grandson of President John Tyler, the 10th President of the United States. Ask him if he does not feel connected to the early days of the Republic. Why does it seem that more time has passed than it has? Technology, appearances, the absence of manure in the streets, and much better plumbing. Which brings me back to my first point. In some ways, not much has changed, or not as much as some people think. It was a miracle that we got the Constitution done. It was a miracle that we survived our divisions in the mid-19th century. It was a miracle that we got through the Depression, the Second World War, and the Cold War. America will always be walking a knife-edge cliff, precariously balanced between a highly diverse sovereign people and the very real need to address, in some form or manner, by whatever leadership people can muster, the challenges of the moment. I find it mildly amusing, that the common refrain now, when explaining why the economy will not improve, centers on the use of the word uncertainty. Things are uncertain, they say. That is why we're having problems. I have a bulletin for you. Things have always been uncertain. You show me someone who complains about uncertainty, and I will show you someone who has skipped American History 101. From the American Genesis forward, the moments when the people of this country could look forward and know exactly what was coming at them have been exactly zero. There was a wonderful observation in one of the London newspapers the other day that maybe uncertainty is in fact the desired condition in politics right now. It makes decisive action look like too much trouble. In other words, according to this writer, politicians who suspect that they don't know what they are doing are reluctant to do anything that might confirm it. My friends, we must break through this and find the heart, the leadership, to act. Large parts of our challenge, when you think about it, are not especially complicated. I've already alluded to transportation. It is simple, not hard. It's about procurement. You either pay for it or you do not. If you do not pay for it, you do not get it. That is where Virginia is right now. Education is, in fact, a more complex challenge because there are legitimate differences, certainly worth debating, on how much to fund schools and allocate resources. Just do not get up and say you can do it for free or by waving a magic wand. Ask Dr. Ayers here what it costs to run the University of Richmond and what it charges to teach your son or daughter, and he will tell you. You take that number and then compare it to what they charge at VCU. You will notice there's a difference. The difference lies in the state support that has supported VCU since its inception. Take out that state support, which is what we've been doing in Virginia, and guess what? You have to get it from somewhere else. In other words, there are consequences for our choices, or lack thereof, and we ought not to pretend otherwise. If we try to finesse the cost of teaching our people, pretending we can do it on the cheap, we hazard our republic. Just ask Thomas Jefferson, or read what he wrote. Public education in a democracy is not an option. If we do not have an enlightened electorate, we do not have a future. These are established truths, and boredom with established truths, as one Oxford historian put it, is a great danger to any society. Right now, we have a bit of a problem on our hands. Pew Research people, on the basis of their surveys, conclude that Americans' values and basic beliefs are more polarized along partisan lines than at any point in the past 25 years. According to Pew, party has now become the single largest fissure in American society, with the values gap between Republicans and Democrats greater than gender, age, race, or class divides. The parties also have become smaller and more ideologically homogeneous over this period. Republicans are dominated by conservatives, while a smaller but growing number of Democrats are liberals. The Pew survey finds that neither party is solely responsible for the growing partisan gap. In different ways, both Democratic and Republican values have become more partisan over the past 25 years, and polarization extends to independents as well. Understand, it is not just the parties that are polarized. So are major sources of information. Cable television news thrives on appealing to narrow segments of the population. So I do not suggest that the situation will be easily resolved. I only say it has to be resolved. We have no choice. Or perhaps more to the point, you have no choice. That is another thing about perspective. There comes a time when the next generation gets the baton. So congratulations, new leaders. You know, in India, during the period of British domination, there was a ritual called Durbar, a great ceremonial procession complete with potentates borne by elephants. It was developed in order to secure the loyalty of the Indian princes. However, in 1903, the British Viceroy, Lord Curzon, changed the ceremony. He prohibited the singing of one traditional hymn because it included a line to the effect that kingdoms may rise and wane. In Curzon's view, the British Empire did not wane. Of course, in less than a half a century, the British Empire no longer functionally existed. Here's the lesson for the day. Self-confident declarations do not substitute for deeds. I would draw your attention to a book published last year by Norman Davies. It is called Vanished Kingdoms, The Rise and Fall of States and Nations. It's about 800 pages of reality. Davies is taught around the world, and his is a fascinating book. I would not suggest, like the guy with the sandwich board, that the end is near. But here's what he writes, quote, "Human nature dictates that everyone is lulled into thinking that disasters only happen to others. Imperial nations and ex-imperial nations are particularly reluctant to recognize how quickly reality moves on." End of quote. America has managed to get this far, and we just might get a lot further. We have been a great people in the past, and we just might have a greater future. But it will not just happen. The stars will align on their own, but leaders are required on earth. In the beginning of the American Republic and throughout its history, we have relied upon leaders who would, in the end, overcome their differences, forge compromises, and blaze a path forward. It's high time to do it again. And in the case of Virginia, I hope that such leaders may be in this audience today. Thanks very much.
You take a couple questions? Okay. Governor Baliles will be happy to take a couple of questions.
Not happy.
He's not happy. He will be grudgingly willing to take a couple of questions. Who would like to rise to the occasion? And I like the way we have self-directed breaks now. That's perfectly fine. We got a lot of work to do, so we trust the people to take care. But we do have a question right here in front. Yes, sir.
Which obviously means that we have a growing movement towards independent voters. Do you see the potential of the independent voters simply expressing their dissatisfaction with the left and the right by perhaps forming a third party?
No.
Thank you.
A good modeling of question and answer. Yes, Mr. Ukrop.
you suggest if you were sort of to lead a movement to sort of bring people together? Something like bipartisan redistricting that would sort of, if this whole group here were to get together and say, hey, we're going to change this. And I think, do you think bipartisan redistricting would have what impact would it have?
Well, in terms of bringing people together, I think this is a great start. I commend Senator Warner and Congressman Davis, President Ayers, for sponsoring this event. Redistricting is, as you know, a decennial exercise, or at least it was until Texas came up with a variation on that theme. But if you think about the next decennial census and then the redistricting that follows, it will be 2020 and 2021. The closer you get to that period, the greater the dynamics will be. If you could establish a process now and get buy-in from both parties and both leaders and say this is the process that we want established and push it forward so that everyone understands that any candidate running for office at the state level would subscribe to that, be pushed to subscribe to that, you might be able to make that work. But a law passed today can be changed tomorrow. It's the one humbling experience you find is in the legislature is, you can pass the statute today and you can ignore it tomorrow, or you can modify it tomorrow. And that happens frequently, as we know. So redistricting is something that I think is sorely needed, a change in the redistricting process. But it is a political exercise, as we all know, and it has been from the very beginning. That's where gerrymandering, the term, comes from, the gerrymandering process that occurred at the early days of our republic. So people have complained, nothing changed. Maybe given the current political situation, we will find this. But don't forget, this country has been divided and polarized in the past. One of the causes of the Civil War, aside from all of our traditional understandings, is the fact that this country was so polarized in the decades prior to 1860. Compromise was not acceptable for a lot of reasons, and in fact, compromise probably would have never occurred anyway. But when you have a society in deadlock, gridlock, unable to reach decisions, unwilling to make compromises, something will happen sooner or later. It may happen as a result of an external shock. It may be a result of some internal event, but it will happen. Redistricting may happen as a result, redistricting changes may happen as a result of that, but I wouldn't hold my breath. Leadership is important, but leadership changes too. And leadership, as it changes over time, will have a different point of view about many subjects.
Another question.
Well, so that we don't become the Egyptian revolution, what forms of institutional support seem to be, if it's no to the third party, well, what forms of institutional support might we begin to consider?
What do you mean by institutional support?
Well, I'm using Senator Warner's term, who made the point that that in Egypt, the institution or the revolution seems to be floundering, and the old forms of power are, having their way. How do we have institutional support to draw the independent thinkers into some kind of functional activity?
Look, I happen to believe in the value of history. It teaches us lessons. How different people lived in 1,000 different ways over time. We can draw lessons from history, and we do suffer from our lack of appreciation of history, the liberal arts, education. To me, one of the great values of a liberal education is that it exposes you to many different disciplines, knowledge bases, and how other people have made decisions in times of great change. When we are without our history, we are without direction. We go in different directions. To me, support of education and transportation, as I used to say when I was running for office, are the building blocks of any economically vital and vibrant community. If you can't move your people and products from one place to the other, you can't compete. If you can't compete, you can't grow. I think it's that fundamental. And by the same token, with education, if the society does not support education, if it does not financially increase its support of education, then education suffers and all of society suffers, because in today's global economy, we have to have an educated citizenry to compete. And if we can't compete, we can't grow. I think it's that simple. So how do you get institutional support? People like you in this room working to change people's ideas and be willing to stand up and say what you believe in support of an objective that you think is important to our society.
In the spirit of equity, someone in the far back has a question, and I think it's only fair that he get a chance to ask it. So could a microphone make it to him? He's making his way to the microphone, so that's a good sign. We getting there? Somebody taking him a microphone? Thank you, Jimmy. Please wait 1 second. There we go.
Thank you very much. Can you talk to the profound shift that Citizens United has brought? Very different campaign finance. We're going to see huge implications certainly this year on the presidential, as well as other races. We saw it in Wisconsin. Can you talk to that generally, and then maybe more specifically, because Virginia has had a unique campaign finance system. What are the implications moving forward? Because it's clearly very different from when you were in public office, even going back to then Governor Warner. Huge implications. Would love to hear your take on that.
Well, I've not had any personal experience with having to deal with that, but I sympathize greatly with those candidates who are seeking office and have to contend with individuals and organizations who can spend unlimited source of money without disclosure. I have tended to think that Virginia's approach in the past of having few restrictions as long as there was instant disclosure and complete sunshine focused on the sources of funds and the amount and the donor would work. I think it's very unusual, but on the other hand, just looking at it historically, we've had, as a people, to rely upon great disputes dividing this country to be determined by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has ruled. It's a 5-4 decision. Now, whether this is sort of like Plessy v. Ferguson that gets reversed 50 years later by Brown v. Board of Education, no one knows. But as long as the Supreme Court ruling stands and is not modified, not revised or reversed, then I think we're in for a pretty rough ride, because I think it then dictates that people with unlimited funds can have a large impact, a much larger impact on the outcome of any election, federal, state, or local. And what I fear is that what we are now witnessing at the national election level will happen at the state and local government level. And if that happens, I think we're in for a real long, rough slide, and it will not be good, and I don't believe history will be kind to us.
We have time for one more question, the answer of which cannot end in the phrase, a long, rough slide. We need to have something that ends with an affirmative outcome. So who has a question like that? Chloe Phillips, yes.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Governor, for your remarks. The Commonwealth of Virginia is close to unique, or unique, I'm not sure, in that we don't re-elect the governor. Does that, or allow the governor to run for immediate re-election, does that help or hurt the Commonwealth?
Depends on who's governor and what you think of the person.
Right, I understand that. Yes, there were times I was thrilled in the past years. But stepping aside, theoretically, why is Virginia like that when so few other states are, when other states are not? And does that help or strengthen, or hurt?
Within the lifetimes of everyone in this room, we have seen a number of states change from the one-term limitation to the point where today Virginia is the only state. Ours has been in effect since the Constitution of 1851. Kentucky and North Carolina within the last couple of decades went from a one-term limit to 2 terms. But in New York, governors can run for a 4-year term forever. They generally get defeated after 2 terms when they seek the 3rd term. New Hampshire and Vermont, states like that, and New England states, there are 2-year terms for governors, and they can run forever. So, the states being what they are free to determine what their course should be. My view is this. The Constitution says 4 years. In my case, I had served in the legislature. I knew all the legislators. I knew state government agencies. I knew people 3, 4, 5, 6 layers down in the agencies. As Attorney General, I had represented the agencies, written legal opinions. So when I became governor, I knew fairly well how well state government was running or not running and where I needed to focus attention. Not everyone has that background when they come to the office, but for me, 4 years was long enough. I mean, I'd accomplished most of the objectives that I'd sought. So for me, that was fine. Now, if you wanted to change the 4-year term, why would you change it? If the answer is to improve governance, then you could argue that, as I do, that if you're going to change the Constitution, why not make it 1 6-year term, which gives a governor, with or without experience, more time to accomplish objectives that may be difficult to achieve in a 4-year term. Now, why do I say 6 years? If you look carefully at governors and presidents who run for a 2nd term, they get in trouble during the campaign season. So they govern ambitiously and energetically for the first 2 years. Then you go into campaign re-election mode. You get through that, then you've got 4 years. So in effect, I would argue that you get 6 years of governing and 2 years of campaigning for re-election. So if you're really interested in improving governance, why not get rid of the 2 years spent on governing for re-election and give the person 1 6-year term? When I was Attorney General, I went to an ABA convention, American Bar Association, prepared to argue either side of the resolution that was being debated. And the question was, should the U.S. Constitution be amended to change the presidential office to 1 6-year term? And Bill Spong, who was then the senator from Virginia, and I were supposed to argue for one of either side. They reached into the bowl and pulled out a number, and that's when we found out which side we were going to argue. And the side that we drew was 1 6-year term. I was convinced then, I still am. If you want to change governance, then let's make it 1 6-year term. Of course, if you like the governor, you're happy with a 6-year term. If you don't like the governor in office, then you're miserable over a 6-year term. So that's up to the people because they have to approve a constitutional change in any event.
Right, thank you.
Thanks very much.
I was just thinking about it from a cost standpoint, because I know in state agencies we would retool every so many years. That was the genesis of my question.
You have my sympathies and my best wishes for changes in the future. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Thanks, Governor. Now, as we prepare for our next session, they gave me this fancy microphone and this stage, and so it would be really asking too much of human nature for me not to abuse it. I'd want to call our attention to something. So far, we've been talking a lot about 2 sectors, the private sector, the sector of business that we're preparing to talk about in our next section. We've also been talking about the public sector of issues of governance. Many of you represent the third sector, which is something that George Washington and the fellow patriots who created this nation could not foresee, that in the space in between, one of America's great genius is the whole voluntary sector, to come up and accomplish things that neither of those by themselves are going to accomplish. Each of you embody, in your own way, filling that vacuum of stepping up to accomplish things that are not get accomplished otherwise. This university is an example of that. Began 1830 to educate poor white boys to be Baptist preachers. Like all the other institutions in Virginia that began with that kind of mission. Then it grows and develops until now we have no denominational affiliation at all and have most of the religions of the world represented here among our students. But Governor Baliles pointed out something, that how much do the public universities of the Commonwealth cost compared to the nonprofits? You may be surprised, and you may take from this what you will, that the amount of debt coming out of the public universities of the Commonwealth is the same as the debt coming out of the University of Richmond. We're spending $65 million this year on financial aid to make it possible, and we're one of only 1% of the schools in the United States that don't ask how much money you have when we admit you and promise to meet 100% of the need that you demonstrate. So people need to understand that we have more options than we think, that the voluntary sector, the self-organizing sector, the sector that's looking around and saying, what good is there that needs to be accomplished that we can accomplish by ourselves without waiting for the government to do it for us, without hoping that the market hands it to us, is bigger and stronger than we might think. Since my two fellow organizers have left the stage, I can tell you what I think we're doing, okay? What we're doing is thinking about what can we do for ourselves today in our own communities, with our own institutions, with the power that we have at our own hands, rather than waiting and hoping that things shift around in governance. That's why I think all of you came here. It's because you know that there are things that you can do, that we can do together, that don't require waiting for history to hand us what we're waiting for. So that's what I think, and the fact that you can take institutions that were created for very local and parochial purposes that are now serving the purposes of the Commonwealth and of the nation and of the world, it shows that there's capacity within our institutions and within our communities that we may not have recognized. So that was an important thing that I think we all need to recognize, that we have potential that we sometimes don't recognize as potential. And Governor Baliles was responsible for that, for mentioning history. And so it triggered the historian in me, and I had no choice but to bring that up. So I have an announcement to make that, in the spirit of bipartisanship, Technology Secretary Duffy, representing Governor McDonnell's office, has joined us here. Yes, and he's up here in the front, so that we have the spirit of that. Thank you very much, and we're delighted. We know the governor's out developing our economy by bringing other businesses here, but we're glad that you're here and take word back about all the goodwill and bipartisan spirit that you see here today. Now, our next two presenters will focus our attention on the economy and on education, the two big issues that are uppermost in the minds of many today. Chris Chmura is president and chief economist for Chmura Economics and Analytics. Her clients throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia and beyond applaud her firm's work for its ability to position them to act in the future. She previously served as associate economist for 7 years at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond and later at Crestar Financial Corporation. Andy Rotherman is co-founder and partner of Bellwether Education, which focuses on improving educational outcomes for low-income students. He previously served as the White House Special Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy in the Clinton administration. He's a frequent contributor on the subject of education and serves on a number of boards and foundations that are devoted to improving the education experience for our young people. He's a graduate of Virginia Tech and his master's from UVA, where he's currently completing his PhD in political science. Join me in welcoming Chris and Andy.